This is the Pepperwood Podcast, a production of Pepperwood, a nonprofit conservation organization based at a 3,200-acre nature reserve near Santa Rosa, California, in the heart of the traditional homeland of the Wapo people. At Pepperwood, we aim to inspire conservation through science. And on this show, we talk to scientists, stewards, and environmental educators about what they do and how they do it. We hope to give you a glimpse into the real experiences of folks who devote their lives to taking care of local ecosystems and sharing them with others. Welcome to episode 3. I am Julianne Bradbury, your host and an environmental educator at Pepperwood. I hope that life is treating you well out there in podcast land and that you are getting a chance to get outside and experience nature in whatever season this episode finds you. As we're preparing this episode for release, we're in the midst of the Californian autumn, which means that we are hopefully near the end of a long dry season here in our Californian climate. Sidebar: the climate in our region is often referred to as Mediterranean climate in textbooks and such. I'm on a personal mission to start calling it the Californian climate, or something more generalizable and at least slightly less based on settler politics. After all, the climate conditions that we experience here have been what they are for probably about as long as the Mediterranean region has been what it is, so why should they get the benefit of naming it? There are some widely accepted naming conventions for climate zones that we could turn to based on the work of various climate scientists from the late 19th to the mid-20th century. According to those classifications, we at Pepperwood experience a wet CS climate, that is, wet as in water, and capital C lowercase s. Wet CS refers to a temperate, dry summer zone with at least 90 centimeters of precipitation per year, and that is certainly us, but as a title, Wet CS is such a bummer of a name that even the climate maps fall back to referring to it as Mediterranean as a shorthand, so forget it. I'm going to say Californian climate until I hear a better idea. In fact, if any of you listeners have a better idea, send it in. What do you think we should call our local climate? Maybe you like wet CS or think we could get used to it, or maybe you have an idea I haven't thought of yet. Send it in to podcast@pepperwoodpreserve.org. Perhaps together we can figure out a way to describe our climate that feels right to everyone. Okay, sidebar/rant over. The point is that as I record this, it is a dry November near the end of a long dry season, and we're presenting a conversation from back in the early days of this dry season, a chat that I had back in July with Pepperwood's dedicated and savvy research specialist, Makayla Freed. I loved getting a glimpse into Makayla's process of gathering information about Pepperwood's forests, starting with a very practical reality of the physical challenges that our field scientists face on this rugged landscape. You'll hear that Makayla had just sustained an injury that kept her on desk duty for a little while this summer, a rare but perhaps statistically inevitable experience for someone who spends long days scrambling up and down the hills of our beautiful landscape. Our conversation also includes some reflections on the process of thinking scientifically, including how careful scientists have to be when drawing conclusions, and how the relationship between scientific research and stewardship plays out here at Pepperwood. On a technical note, I, your intrepid host/sound engineer, have to apologize for the sound quality of this interview. This was one of my first recorded conversations, and the sound equipment we used ended up being nothing more sophisticated than the voice recorder app on my smartphone. The words still come through clearly, but when you experience the acoustics, I think that you will join me in thanking Zach Winter, Pepperwood's Chief Operations Officer, for approving the purchase of the proper microphones and other equipment that I have been using recently. I hope I haven't scared you off because the conversation has such great content, you might just forget the middling recording quality. So please enjoy this conversation between myself and Pepperwood's research specialist, Makayla Freed, which took place in July of 2024. Thank you so much for taking some time out, although right now I know that you are in sort of
data input mode because you have sustained a battle wound in the field.
That's part of the nature of this work sometimes, right? Is that, you try to keep yourself as safe as possible, but you never know. So I just was hiking out in the slopes, the steep slopes out in the hills, actually getting done with some of my forest monitoring work and wrapping some of it up for the summer even, which is really exciting. And maybe the excitement's part of what had me galloping up the hill too fast. My foot slipped, my fist went forward into a rock, and I got a boxer's fracture in my metacarpal. So
oh my goodness,
oopsie.
yeah.
But the good thing is we've just wrapped up so much data collection type stuff that now I was actually kind of going to naturally be doing some of that anyway. There's still plenty of work to be done, but at least I have data to enter, right?
Yes. Well, that's a mark of the season. So as we're recording this, right, we just hit July 1st. So you just have finished up sort of the lion's share of your field work for this season. So that's good to know that you do have those data entry seasons sort of planned in anyway. So good timing.
I know.
With your injury. Yeah.
It worked out. I mean, there was still, how it is, there's always more to be done. And especially we installed a couple more plots recently, which is super exciting.
Yeah.
And we wanted to get those instrumented. And we've got them partially instrumented, but we wanted to tag some trees and get some baseline data on our trees and shrubs, seedlings coming up, things like that. So we did a good amount of work so far, and we do have time. It's not like not doing this is going to put us off too bad.
Right.
But it'll just be something we're going to kick the can down the road for.
It's a long game regardless, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. Speaking of setting up new plots, that might be a great entry point to talk about what these forest monitoring plots that I've heard so much about are all about. So to start off with, who or what are you monitoring out there in the forest?
So much. I think it was around 2019 we started installing forest monitoring plots. And Pepperwood already has many plots set up. Many of the ones that people think about are David Ackerley's plots. So David Ackerley out of UC Berkeley, he has his whole network of forest monitoring plots out here, upwards of 50.
Wow.
But then through funding from California Department of Fish and Wildlife, we were going to get the opportunity to install our own forest monitoring plots and also be kind of more specific with what we at Pepperwood maybe specifically want to learn about.
Great.
The Ackerley plots have been, primarily, so there is some soil moisture type work done in there. There are data loggers called hobos that are constantly logging information on relative humidity and temperature in those plots. But they're mainly related to vegetation, which is great. And we want to know a lot about vegetation, but we said, okay, with these CDFW plots, how about we do vegetation and we expand upon it? So we have certainly work with trees and shrubs, seedlings coming up. So we look at seedling recruitment for trees and shrubs as well. We monitor the herbaceous layer, so think forbs, grasses. But we also have cover boards that we've installed. So we have 9 per plot, which with now 15 plots, that's a lot of cover boards. Yeah. And we use those to monitor herpetofauna, so reptiles and amphibians in our forests. We also have hobo data loggers, so we're constantly getting information on relative humidity and temperature as well in these little microclimates. There is a surprising amount of variation in the microhabitats, microclimates around the preserve, and so having these hobos is a really neat way to be able to say specifically, okay, this is what the climate is like at this spot, and also relate that to what kind of vegetation we're seeing there, what kind of herpetofauna activity we're seeing, maybe the mammals moving through. So we also have wildlife cameras at the center of each plot that are constantly taking a look at what kind of wildlife we're seeing, so mammals, right? So there's a lot of really cool work that we do. We are also hoping to expand upon it. We're planning on adding fungal surveys to the picture as well, which would be cool. Because it's ecology, right? And ecology is so dynamic, it's so diverse, that there really is no end to what you can do in these. But we're just trying to kind of balance that out with, okay, what are our interests? What kind of time and funding do we have?
Gotcha.
Things like that. We also do fuels monitoring. And so that's an important part of the picture if you're thinking about things like the management that we're doing. So what kinds of stewardship techniques are we putting out there?
Right.
Also for us to have data related to, oh, now there's a wildfire, and we have data related to what kind of fuels were out there
Gotcha.
before the wildfire. But obviously we're especially monitoring that with the idea of stewardship involved. So if we were to do some thinning work, if we were to do some prescribed burning work, being able to understand fuels on the ground. So that's using Brown's transects is what we call them.
Okay. So fuels, really, that goes for all plant life in a way.
Yeah.
Right? All different sorts. Because everything is flammable, however big it is, right?
Exactly.
Cool.
And then we go more in depth as far as fuels are related. When we are doing our tree surveys, we also do a ladder fuel height for our living trees. So essentially think of a ladder. Ladder fuels can carry fire upward, have the potential to carry fire upward. And so understanding where our ladder fuels are located can help us to understand the part of the kind of fire conversation related to how high might a wildfire go, or might a prescribed burn go? And let me say, there's a lot that goes into it. It's a lot more than just where are your fuels located, right? There's a lot that goes into it. Wind, and if it's prescribed burning, where the ignition takes place, and temperature, all kinds of things. But ladder fuels, like I say, can be a part of the conversation that can really help us to understand what potential effects fire might have, whether it's a living tree that's still standing, or maybe we're thinking about the herbaceous layer. So again, with ecology, kind of the main theme is having a bunch of things that all speak to the conversation. They can answer a lot of different questions, but it's ecology. And so they're all surprisingly connected in ways that you might not even think. And it's important to keep in mind with this conversation, with these ideas, that it can be very easy as humans for us to say, I saw this thing and then this event happened. Let's say it's a prescribed burn or whatever. And then I saw this other thing happen. So A plus B always equals C. And that means that the result that I saw is due to that prescribed burn.
Right.
That's tricky. And I would be careful with saying those things. And at Pepperwood, the research team really tries to keep that in mind and take that into consideration. Because even though you can draw correlations and you can suspect certain things, there's a lot of information that goes into it. And that's part of collecting all these data, right? And being able to have these conversations with the Ackerley lab about what kind of data they're seeing as well, what things they're seeing out in the field, and be able to kind of add to that. So as much as we are trying to monitor these different things, there's always kind of that little piece in there where it's like taking it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, a little skepticism.
Yeah,
always.
and like just being, I think science at its best is kind of hypercritical of itself at its best.
Sure.
There could be a lot of ego that goes into it, but I think at its finest, it's going to be really looking at the different parts of the picture and understanding, okay, these all could be the case, but this is kind of where things seem to be trending as far as the data, as far as what's really being seen.
Right.
A lot of this takes a lot of time, right? A lot of time to gather this information and look and actually speak to it years down the line rather than just the year after or something.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like you kind of walk around with a healthy conservative look at the data that you're taking, because it's easy to get excited about numbers when you're gathering them.
Right.
So I love that idea. Alrighty, so you've got this fuels data that relates to both the woody and the herbaceous being just kind of anything that's growing as a plant but not woody. And you've got soil moisture and both humidity and temperature coming in. And then you have these cover boards and these cameras. And are those sort of the outliers as far as being geared toward animals? Is that kind of the data that you're taking there?
Yeah, I would say that. We also added audio moths recently, so listening to birds in our forests, and we also had the question, well, usually these are used for birds, could we use them for bats? And so that's something that we're currently exploring.
Excellent.
That's a very recent installation, and we just kind of gathered our first round of data on that, so I have yet to learn anything about that, but it's kind of a real kind of point of excitement for a lot of people.
Sure.
Yeah.
Through the cover boards, who are you looking at?
Yeah, so as far as what you said a second ago, this is sort of the outlier, if you will, in terms of we're wanting to know, okay, what's the animal situation? It's very easy to monitor plants because they sit still for you, generally speaking, right? They might wave in the wind and hit you in the face a little bit, but the animals, they're kind of moving around. And so, okay, how do we learn about them? And so that was the idea with the cover boards, is you lay down these pieces of plywood and these set locations on their own transects, right? Different than the herbaceous transects. And then we go through, right now we have a December through June cycle with the idea of capturing the amphibian kind of activity as well as the reptile activity and kind of everything, that little in-between transition zone, if you will. And we go in there, like I said, bi-weekly, December through June. And we lift these boards, we take soil moisture measurements at these boards with these soil moisture probes called the hydrosense. And we document who we're seeing underneath. And we also added to the conversation, well, you know, we don't really have any information on invertebrates, so let's just add that as well. These are often the food sources for these animals, so let's indicate that as well. And then the cameras obviously are constantly sitting there. They're motion censored, and so they will trigger and snap a few shots of the wildlife that we see as well coming through, so the larger mammals.
So that covers kind of a lot, right? You've got your birds, maybe your bats through audio. You've got cameras for sort of like larger megafauna to be taken care of. And then under the cover boards, you're getting some interesting things, right? You're getting, your reptiles, your amphibians. Are you also experiencing a little bit of the small mammals through that?
We are, yeah. So two of the most common disturbances we see under our cover boards are rodent disturbance and ant disturbance. So that could be anything from a rodent that's built a nest or built tunnels underneath. Sometimes you'll lift a board and it's just filled with a pile of nuts that have been ripped open, and you can tell a rodent has, kind of cached them under there.
Yeah.
So we do get, variety of disturbance there. And obviously the ants is kind of what you can imagine. Oftentimes you lift a board and there's just this horde of ants all over the place. And the idea behind documenting these disturbances is that these could be impacting what herpetofauna are under there or are not.
Well, that's interesting.
Using these boards.
Yeah, if your original goal was sort of to capture the herpetofauna, the reptiles and amphibians, it's funny what we sort of quantify as a disturbance versus data, which I mean, I think it sounds like you're treating disturbances as its own kind of data for sure.
Totally.
But it's funny to think of like signs that rodents were there as like, oh, this is getting in the way of my data, when it's also totally data on its own, right?
Well, and it could be, we talk about like I said, it's an impact, a potential impact of how herpetofauna may or may not be using that board. And so rodents, for example, if you are a snake, that's probably going to be more of an attractant to the board, right? Is that sort of activity. Whereas, who knows, maybe for amphibians, I don't know, maybe they are less likely to want to go under there, maybe they don't care. It's hard to say, but it's just something that we know. But yeah, we do note if we see any mammal activity, and sometimes we do. It seems like every year, at least a couple times, you lift the board and there is an active a rodent literally underneath there. So
with their
they
cute
use
little
these
faces
as well.
Yes.
Yeah. And we try to minimize our own disturbance as much as possible. That's why we're doing a bi-weekly, so around 2 times a month.
Right. So you're not the human traffic isn't so high that all the animals decide that they want to be elsewhere.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. And actually related to human traffic, I just want to say this piece because we've kind of, we're learning the hard way and we're adjusting, we're pivoting based on this. But because the cover boards are the most trafficked project, if you will, in these plots. Most of these plots, it's like, oh, we went out in spring and we collected some data on the herbs, and we went out a couple months later and collected data on the trees. Right. And then I come in there every now and again and collect data from the cameras. But as far as regular visits, that's where the cover boards come into play. Right. And we really try to do, pairs, the buddy system, obviously for safety, but sometimes it's 3, maybe even 4 people in these plots. And that heavy foot traffic shows in these plots. So we're kind of doing let's pivot now, right? We're learning from this situation where if you send foot traffic there long enough, pretty soon you see trails go in there and you see an impact on the herbaceous layer very, very easily. I mean, it's as clear as the eye can see, right?
Right.
You just look there and you say, yeah, it looks like people have been walking through there. And especially along our coverboard transects, because those are where people are going, right?
So it's something we don't always think about when it comes to monitoring impacts, right? We always think about, well, it's expensive to have all these man hours, like, people are the most expensive part of any project. So like getting this long-term data monitoring, it's important to, get funding or whatnot. But in some cases, it's like, well, it's not just the cost of, the upfront cost of getting that done. It's also that like the more you observe something, the more you're impacting. You can't observe a system without changing it at least a little bit. So having a light hand in that way is another really important consideration.
Yeah. So there are discussions being had about, okay, what do we do going forward? Do we give these a year of rest? Do we make the survey season shorter, or do we survey only once a month? We're figuring this out. We're having these conversations, but yeah, it's something, like I said, that you learn the hard way and then you adjust based on it. You have to always be willing to adjust, and that's where our protocol has really been all about too. Is, okay, we wrote this out and this seemed like the right idea, and maybe we referenced a few other protocols, but then once you go out in the field, no matter what, it seems like there's always this tiny little, even rare situation that comes up that has you all kind of scratching your heads and flipping through the pages of the protocol and saying, this really doesn't address this properly. We need to go in and make a few changes or something. And that's, it's constantly being updated.
Well, you just can't think of everything ahead of time. You just can't do it.
No,
absolutely.
You can't. You try your best.
Absolutely. And of course, whenever you're creating a project, right, the whole idea is like, well, we're make our protocol and we stick to it. And that when that has to shift a little bit, you have to make some really important decisions there, saying like, okay, well, the data after this point won't be we can't compare it perfectly to the data we were taking before we changed that process, but we're not disturbing the area in the same way that we were, right? That can be really important.
Yeah, totally,
okay,
totally. So we'll see. It's an ever evolving process.
I'd love to hear about just any ideas you have about fungal surveys. Do you have any idea how those might take place, or have you talked about that at all?
Yeah, so we did write up a protocol, which we will certainly go out and use, and it'll certainly work in some ways, and it certainly will not work in
there we go. And you'll learn from it.
That's the nature of protocols. But yeah, we're planning, so we don't want to do anything too intense, and we certainly don't want to do anything too invasive, because when it comes to fungus, you can go crazy on it. There are fungi that only exist, they parasitize animals, basically.
Right.
So you could be looking for insects. You can be flipping rocks and logs, right? We don't want to do anything that's that invasive.
Right.
We just want to kind of start to gain an understanding of what kind of fungal species we're seeing out in our forests, because we don't really have many long-term surveys related to this.
Right.
So this is an opportunity to start to get at that question.
Okay.
So right now, I believe the plan is we're going to go to a certain select plots that we have. Some of them are harder to access than others, and if you're thinking about it, the peak fungal season is when the roads are going to be wet and muddy.
Oh yeah.
So some of them are just not going to be super accessible.
So it's a little bit like grasslands, where like if you go out in the wrong season, it's just identifying species is just much more difficult.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Or you're going to miss species altogether because they have a certain window that you missed.
Right.
And
where they're showing themselves. Yeah.
And that's the thing too. If you want to be all inclusive, you would go the whole year round, and you probably would. You lift everything, right? You check every nook and cranny.
But you don't want to tear apart every nook and cranny.
Exactly. We're not trying to be too invasive. So I think right now we're going to be planning on setting these select locations that are going to be able to be traveled out to by foot, and not have to drive anywhere, muddy, right? Because there are a couple plots in particular that it's like, we would love data from these spots, but it's not going to be possible, starting around November, right?
So very practical considerations come into consideration. Yeah.
Right. It's like, if only these were accessible all the time, When is our network of zip lines going to be put further?
I was picturing more of like what's the Star Trek
I'm just
teleportation
thinking,
device.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, anyway.
I was thinking like a jetpack.
A jetpack is fun. All right, we got all kinds of ideas. We got zip lines, we got jetpacks, we got, transporters. Transporters, that's what I was looking for.
One day.
Absolutely.
But as far as like our plan right now, I believe the way that we have planned it out is at these certain plots. So we, I'll get to my plot, right? And then I'll set a timer for 15 minutes. It might be 30 minutes because I think we might have said then we could do 15 per person, because the idea is, and we do the same sort of thing at herbaceous monitoring as well. With herbaceous monitoring, we do an all-around plot survey because there are just some plants that we're not capturing in our herbaceous transects that are located in the plot.
So then you kind of bonus added a little area search along with doing the transect. Okay.
Exactly. And so with the herbaceous monitoring, and when we go and we take a plot level species list, it would be an hour for one person, but if we have two people, okay, well then we do 30 minutes a person. We're considering it the same amount of effort.
Many hands light work.
Exactly. And so we're doing a similar thing for the fungal surveys. Like I said, I think it might be 30 minutes with like 15 minutes per person. That's another thing that my injury has reiterated is, thankfully I was able to get out of the field on my own just fine, but there is so much work around here that needs to be done, and it can be really hard to find a field buddy. It can be really hard.
I know. I wanted to be your field buddy a lot of times, and I couldn't do it. So I will speak to that for sure.
Yeah, and I mean we have some wonderful volunteers who are willing to do anything and everything too, but schedules don't always line up, or something comes up, and they're volunteers. You can't expect them to do everything, obviously, but it just means that there's a lot of times where we have to go out on our own, and this sort of thing happens. And so with the fungal surveys, we've kept in mind too, we really would like to continue this buddy system.
Yeah.
Now the tricky thing, I would say, and this is just kind of coming from me, is that fungus, they are so diverse. Fungi are so diverse. There are a lot out there.
Yeah.
And
so being one person trying to assess species is like you'd have to have an encyclopedic knowledge.
Oh my gosh.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's almost the same problem as, it's not every person who goes out isn't going to take the same data. Right? This is a very skill-based monitoring process.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to fit the bill, right? So you don't just need person hours.
Right.
You need very specific person hours, like skill set person hours.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's an even more precious commodity.
I know. It really is. So we're going to see how it goes.
Okay.
This last winter, I was able to hike around and kind of just, eyeball and get a sense of what's out there. Which was a chance for me to kind of get my practice in. But yeah, as far as training someone else or whatnot, it's going to be tricky. But we're gonna go out and we're gonna start to get information on our fungal species out there, and it's going to be exciting. I saw my first death caps on the preserve just this past winter. I knew they were out there somewhere. I've seen them in different parts of the county, but it was an example of like, hey, this is kind of cool. This is anecdotal information, right? Like I wasn't taking data down anywhere or anything, but it's something where you can kind of start to tell people, oh, this is what we're seeing. And once you can gather numbers related to it and get species written down, that's an exciting process.
Well, and I mean, on one hand, it's a headache because you're trying to, get the data and have it all be, lined up and quality checked and all of that. But it also is like this great opportunity for you as a professional to be learning a whole, like identification for a whole new kingdom of species. So that's like, what an incredible thing as far as the experience.
Totally. It's going to be a huge developmental opportunity for me, career-wise. And I want to spread that to other people too. Like I love to educate people on this as well and get them jazzed about it. And so what a better way to do it than to start learning more things myself and being on the student side of things, which I always try to, take time in my life to make sure I sit in that seat because it's just fun. And you learn stuff.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to return to that in a little while when we talk about what makes this work possible. But for now, I'm curious what you envision. How might the data that you're taking at these forest monitoring plots, how can that potentially impact future work here at Pepperwood? Like, for instance, the stewardship work or the prescribed burns or anything. What do you envision?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, A plus B doesn't always equal C,
Mm-hmm.
but you still do occasionally find trends. Like that's what science is all about, is really finding statistical significance between certain things, right?
Yeah, legitimate patterns.
Yeah, find those patterns and be able to say, I'm noticing a pattern, and write on that, right? And educate people about that. And so I think if we can continue finding patterns through these data, and as it relates to prescribed burning, like I think that's a really beautiful opportunity we have here. We have the research and preserve management team. So ideally, those two things would marry together. I don't want to say perfectly because it's not a perfect fit ever. However, you learn things on the research side and then maybe you pivot or you do things on the stewardship side. Or you do things on the stewardship side and we learn on the research side what kind of effects we're maybe seeing, what kinds of results we're seeing. So I think doing that on site is fantastic. What a unique and awesome opportunity that we have between the two teams to be able to gain that kind of information and have that kind of background on what's being done out here, but also to be able to expand it and allow that elsewhere. So that's the other beautiful thing about science, I think, is being able to communicate it and share it among others.
Right.
So be able to show others with these cover boards, right? Like I said, like anecdotally, a lot of foot traffic in there. We need to knock that off.
Right.
Like we need to slow down on that a little bit, right?
Yeah, that was one pattern that you've noticed here, which is, you know what? If we go out there every 2 weeks, it starts to look kind of trampled.
Right.
Right.
So that's not even, that's just me. That's just me and the preserve, a few of us going and looking and saying, man, those look really trampled, right?
Yeah.
And being able to communicate to other people, like, hey, this is what we've noticed. If you do cover boards, be warned, right? Learn from our mistakes. And I think that's another opportunity that the data that we're gaining will provide is, we did this forest thinning work and we really didn't like it, or we did like it, or we pile burned afterward and we found that was a really good way to reduce some of the fuels before a prescribed burn. Whatever the situation is, that to me is the ideal, is being able to inform our own stewardship and inform stewardship and research elsewhere with what we're gaining here. And I think that we have a really cool opportunity to do that. And because there are some other places that do this as well, we're able to gain information from them too about what they're doing and just learn from each other.
Yeah, either back up each other's claims or notice when there's exceptions or all those great things.
And through climate change too, monitoring is always such an important, crucial piece. Because if you're not necessarily, if we didn't have journal entries from naturalists, for example, who were seeing things happening phenologically in the past with certain plants, we wouldn't necessarily know today that those were observations being made, and we might just make assumptions about, it's this plant's always flowered this time of year, right? So it's a similar thing of data through time.
Right.
How was it speaking to what's happening through time with climate change, with habitat fragmentation, whatever it is?
Right. So how well the trees are surviving whatever impacts they're going through, right? Whatever the sort of ambient experience is going to be, right? Whatever the temperature is, whatever the humidity is, keeping track of that and watching, what's the survivability, or how well are they recruiting new plants?
Yeah.
All of that is data that can really show big long-term changes.
Exactly. And scientists already have ideas and predictions of what may happen. And so to be able to speak to that,
right?
Either say, we're totally seeing that same thing, or, that's not really happening the way you thought, is cool, is a really cool thing to have a part in.
Well, long-term monitoring data sets are notoriously difficult to even make happen. So it's incredible that Pepperwood is investing in these things, right? Really taking the time to set these things up and follow through with it. What makes it possible?
So like I mentioned with these plots that we installed recently, funding from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has been a huge part of that. Obviously, we're a nonprofit, so a lot of the stuff that we do has to do with donor funding as well, whether it's related to the tools, the scientific equipment we get, you name it. So that's a piece as well, generous donations, but also, grant funding. And like I said, this big funding that's come through with California Department of Fish and Wildlife has been a huge piece of making this possible. We also have volunteers who've helped with some of the data collection as well. That's a huge piece, and staff who've been, ready, willing, and able to participate in whatever ways possible and pick up the slack in whatever ways possible, especially with my, hand situation.
Right, I know.
So that's a part of it as well, and just these continued partnerships, like I mentioned, Dr. David Ackerley, like. He already had this plot network set up, and so that was another piece. There are many protocols and different things that we've been able to reference, and just peeling through various studies where we've been able to kind of take bits and pieces and, these people have noticed this thing, or those people have noticed that thing, and incorporate lessons learned by others into what we're doing, as well as, like I said, David Ackerley, whose work is going on site, and so being able to be like, hey, you're doing some of these very similar surveys going on. We really want to do that for our own Pepperwood forest monitoring as well.
Right, and they've already worked through maybe some of the kinks that come up site-specific, or even some have found some of the interesting results that you want to continue to monitor and see if they continue.
Exactly, it's so true.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay.
But what's been cool with some of the CDFW funding is that we have been able, so often the case with grant funding is they want you to do something new, right?
Right.
And it's so hard because new is great and we love new, but also it can mean that some of the really cool stuff that we want to continue goes by the wayside. It's like it's old news, so we want to sweep that under the rug and we want to focus on something else. But it's so important, and it's long-term monitoring, right? So it's like, what are you missing out on by having to potentially drop things that you could otherwise be continuing?
So yeah, that speaks to that crux, that point where it's grant funding is such a wonderful resource, but so often it just structurally undervalues long-term monitoring processes, because every grant does want to have a little something to say for itself. It created something new. It doesn't want to just give credit into a long-term monitoring plot. So maybe it's just that much more important that in addition to grant funding, which I'm sure gets a lot of work done here at Pepperwood, it's so important that we do have the community support that just says, Pepperwood, we want Pepperwood to keep Pepperwooding. We want it to keep doing what you're doing, and that's kind of where the non-grant affiliated just donations come into play, right? So that's really important. That that's the beauty of a donation, is that it's not coming with these sort of addendums and quid pro quos. It just sort of comes and says, we trust you to do the right thing with this funding and to advance science.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if we don't have the support, we can't do the work. We just can't.
Yeah.
If we have, a grant there, that's great. But if we don't have any funding that's there, we literally have to sit down and say, we can't do this anymore. And it is a very helpless feeling, but it's the way things go a lot of times.
Yeah.
So the fact that we've been able to do this for as long as we have, like I said, I think these plots began being installed in 2019, and bit by bit we've added, a little bit more and more through funding, through grants, through donations, whatever we have out there, with just adding 2 more at a further point of the preserve than we have had any of our own forest monitoring plots before. It's exciting, and it's we're so grateful that we can do it, because otherwise we literally would just say, well, too bad, so sad, we can't continue gathering that information that is pretty cool. And plenty of places think it's pretty exciting that we have this information. We do too.
And it's a victory to have kept this project going and growing for 5 years, and yet from a long-term data set, you're hoping that that's just the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you want decades of data.
You want decades and decades, and if you think about it too, COVID came in right toward the beginning of that, right? And so you would think there are a lot of things around the world, research-wise, life-wise, you name it, that had to get a big put on pause or had to end altogether because of this pandemic. And somehow, some way, with a lot of things still pausing around here, even at Pepperwood, we were able to keep this project alive and going by some miracle.
Alrighty, so is there anybody else that you would like to shout out in particular, as far as what makes your work here?
There are just so many specific names that could be called out, but the thing is, I would miss one and feel horrible. So I'll just kind of leave it at large and say our phenomenal volunteer community has made a lot of things a possibility, has kept a lot of this stuff going, and has alleviated a lot of the pressure off of staff. So they're phenomenal. I can't thank them enough. We have a really great research and preserve management team who work together beautifully to make these things happen. And as far as other people to thank, like I mentioned, we have that wonderful grant funding from CDFW that has gotten a lot of this able to be done, and then support from donors.
Yeah.
Because again, if the support isn't there, we can't do it.
Well, I'm glad it's being done. It sounds like it's really a very inclusive approach to sort of monitoring forests. And I'm going to talk separately to Michelle about her experience with the grasslands, and I'm interested in how that's going to be a different story, and to what extent it's going to be the same. So thank you so much for talking to me about this.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to get this featured.
Welcome back to Better Recorded Audio. I know that transition is pretty jarring. And thank you again to Makayla for sharing her experience and thoughts with us. If that conversation sparked questions in your mind, please send them in to podcast@pepperwoodpreserve.org, and we will do our best to answer them in upcoming episodes. Our gratitude to the whole Pepperwood team for their support of the podcast, and one more special shout out to Zach Winter for helping upgrade our recording equipment so that future conversations will come through with much better sound quality. And now it's time for the next installment of the Nature Sound Guess Who game! Last time on Nature Sound Guess Who, we heard this curious sound clip. A few guesses were submitted on our social media posts at Facebook, where we are Pepperwood, and Instagram, where we are Pepperwood Preserve CA. Your guesses included mountain lion, otter, and a general guess for some kind of carnivorous mammal. Very good indeed, listeners. It is a mammal, and they do often eat meat. Although they are not obligate carnivores, they actually tend to eat also quite a bit of fruits, nuts, and grains. That vocalist you heard was the gray fox. That wonderful recording was taken at Pepperwood by one of our fabulous volunteer stewards, George Jackson, who posted the observation to iNaturalist.org in July of 2021. Gray foxes are scientifically known as Eurocion cinerio argenteus, and I defy you to pronounce that any better. They are delightful little omnivores who are known for being accomplished tree climbers. They are active all year round, primarily at night or at dawn and dusk, but can occasionally be seen during the day. In fact, one of the visiting elementary school groups in Pepperwood's Students Conducting Environmental Inquiry program, or SCENIC for short, was lucky enough to spot a fox on the trail just a few weeks ago. Tragically for me, I wasn't the lucky hike leader on that one. Oh, heartbreak. If you'd like to learn more about our charming gray fox neighbors, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has a set of life history summaries and range maps for many California species available on their website. That's where I double-checked my information, and we'll include a link to that webpage on our show notes. Now, get your ears and brains ready for the next Nature Sound Guess Who game challenge. Here comes the next mystery sound clip in 3, 2, 1. And again in 3, 2, 1. As always, submit your guesses to podcast@pepperwoodpreserve.org or to the episode 3 announcement on our Facebook or Instagram. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep your ears tuned into nature.